Let's talk about fingerprints. If I'm good at anything, it's binge watching TV. I watch crime dramas like SVU, Criminal Minds, NCIS, Bones, you name it. And I'd be lying if I said murder hasn't been on my mind since I'm quarantined at home with my family. Kidding. If I was personally involved in a murder, there's only one person I would want doing the forensic analysis, and that's the icon Abby from NCIS. In the middle of a global pandemic and social distancing, Gibbs and his team have been called to help solve the case of a murder of a wealthy man who lived in Nowhere, North Carolina. Mr. Finch lived with his wife and her 2 children, Jack and Sarah, as well as their own child, Alex. One day, Mrs. Finch called the police in hysterics to report the murder of her husband. Everyone in the community suspected foul play, as Mr. Finch's wealth was no secret. All of a sudden, neighbors and strangers alike speculated that Mrs. Finch and her 2 children from her other marriage were suspects in this murder. The crew from NCIS came together, from 6 feet apart, to analyze the crime scene. The weapon was a discarded kitchen knife that had been carelessly tossed out of the back window. Mr. Finch was murdered in the living room of his home sometime in the middle of the night. Gibbs and his team had to rely on genetic analysis of the DNA to get answers. Genozo called up to their headquarters in Washington, D.C. to ask their forensic analysis Abby about her findings.
Hey boss, I'm in the lab doing this DNA fingerprint analysis of the quarantine killer case. You say the family of the victim didn't have any outside contact with the world as they are following proper social distancing guidelines. So I think the killer lived in their house. Check this out. A fingerprint dusting of the knife showed 4 different sets of prints. To no one's surprise, the prints match Miss Finch, Jack Crow, Sarah Crow, and Alex Finch. I sent over 2 VNTR loci I have been comparing to the DNA evidence found at the scene of the murder weapon. Give it a look and tell me what you think.
Now, if I were on the team, I would use the knowledge I've gained from principles of genetics to show who is obviously Mr. Finch's murderer. Comparing the 2 VNTR loci Abby has presented to the team, we were able to see the distinguishing similarities to the 2 DNA samples and the DNA of the victim compared to that of the suspects. At the first locus, we see that the first sample exactly matches Mr. Finch and Jake. It does not match Mrs. Finch, Alex, or Sarah. At the second locus, the first sample exactly matches Mr. Finch and Mrs. Finch, but not Jake, Alex, or Sarah. This allows us to conclude that the first DNA sample came from our victim, Mr. Finch. To determine the killer, we look at the second DNA sample. Here, we find an exact match for Mrs. Finch and Alex on the first loci, and an exact match for Alex and Sarah at the second. The banding pattern clearly indicates that Alex Finch is his father's killer. Was money the only motive for murder? Was Alex skeptical of his relationship to either of his parents? Although not relevant to the identity of the killer, since we've already determined that Alex is guilty, any suspicion that his relation to his father or mother could have caused motive beyond money can be dismissed. The banding patterns on the VNTR shows the 2 alleles passed to him for both his mother and father. This means Mr. and Mrs. Finch are in fact his biological parents. Here are some of my resources.